Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss welcoming newcomers and addressing the trauma of migration. This webinar comes from Mennonite Central Committee. MCC is a worldwide ministry of Anabaptist churches that shares God's love and compassion for all in the name of Christ by responding to basic human needs and working for peace and justice. One of the ways we do that in the United States is through our immigration network. Our immigration network works to help to educate about immigration issues, advocate for sensible, humane immigration laws, and work to build peace in communities along the U.S.-Mexico border. In addition, our regions offer documentation services to help immigrants navigate the complex immigration system. Within MCC, my role, I'm Charity Stowell. I'm the Newcomer Connections Coordinator, and my role is to help connect churches to organizations that serve refugees and asylum seekers throughout the community and throughout the United States. Another part of our role is to connect congregations and groups to resources and education. As you welcome refugees and asylum seekers and other migrants. And one of our hopes is to build a network of welcoming Anabaptist communities to connect with each other, share best practices, encourage and pray for everyone involved. And if you'd like to connect, I encourage you to reach out to me. My email is very easy to remember. It is welcome@mcc.org. Today's webinar, we'll be talking about addressing the impact of and trauma of migration. Today we have two different speakers, Saulo Padilla, who is MCC U.S.'s Immigration Education Coordinator, and as well as Elaine Zook Barge, who is a Trauma and Resilience Educator and Consultant. And we are so grateful to have you here and joining us today. So before we jump into the content of our webinar, I wanted to first give us some time to interact and intercede for those that God may be lifting into our hearts right now. This is an intercessory prayer from the Iona community. And in the pauses, I welcome you to lift up in prayer anybody that you may know or you may not know who are suffering at this point. Loving God, we hold in your presence those who suffer pain and ill health. May they know the deep peace of Christ. Loving God, we hold in your healing presence those who suffer in mind and spirit. May they know the deep peace of Christ. Loving God, we hold in your healing presence the suffering people of your world and the places where people are experiencing hurt and division, including places of hurt and division in our own lives. May we know the deep peace of Christ. Loving God, we hold in your healing presence those experiencing grief and loss. May they know the deep peace of Christ. Loving God, we hold in your healing presence those who need wisdom for their next steps. May they know the deep peace of Christ. Loving God, we hold in your healing presence those people and situations that seem broken beyond repair. May they know the deep peace of Christ. Loving God, we hold in your healing presence those whose needs are not known to us, but who are known by you. May they know the deep peace of Christ. Glory to God, from whom all love flows. Glory to Jesus, who showed his love through suffering. And glory to the Holy Spirit, who brings light to the darkest places. Amen. One of the reasons I think it's so important to intercede on behalf of those we know is because there are often situations, especially when we talk about the trauma of migration and trauma that especially refugees and asylum seekers experience, where it genuinely feels like there are systems that are completely broken. And so I wanted to share very quickly about my own experiences working with refugees and immigrants as a direct service provider. And at times, I will say that I leaned primarily on intercession, because there are times and situations where it feels like that is all you can lean on. So I wanted to kind of share some perspectives that I've heard from newly arrived refugees and from direct service providers. So this is something that was written by one of my old students in a multi-level refugee class that I taught. And we were talking about emotions. And so the students all had to write about how they were feeling at that point and why. So this was from a student from Pakistan who came to the United States as a refugee with his family because they were forced to flee their country because they were part of a religious minority. And so the question was, why do you feel blank? And so he chose, why do you feel happy? I always feel happy. Do you know why? Because I don't expect anything from anyone. Expectations always hurt. And when I first read that, I was, at first kind of taken aback. I felt very sad at first, but then as I've worked with refugees and as I've experienced, a lot of different situations as a direct service provider, I found myself really relating to his words. And one of the reasons is that when I worked in refugee resettlement and continued to volunteer with refugee resettlement, I saw over and over again when refugees arrive in the United States, they have gone through a lot of trauma, of course, being forced to flee in the country of asylum. They may have had limited access to many different resources. And so there are sometimes people have high expectations of what will happen when they come to the United States. But unfortunately, throughout resettlement, the reality kind of sinks in pretty quickly. So within resettlement, there's a huge focus on self-sufficiency. For refugees, and even more so for asylum seekers and other migrants, there is just a lack of long-term support. When families arrive, they may receive, 3 to 6 to 8 possibly months of support. But after that, they are really supposed to rely on themselves and get connected with work almost immediately. And in addition to, that quick scurrying of needing to find work and needing to provide for their families, there's also needing to meet their psychosocial needs, but there isn't really a lot of support within the resettlement world to meet those needs. So a lot of times families that I interacted with would experience a lot of deep loneliness and isolation. Also a lost sense of belonging. Language and cultural barriers meant that, they wouldn't necessarily be able to reach out to people beyond people who already spoke their own language or who were from their same cultural background. And in addition, in the United States, a lot of families were surprised when they themselves also experienced discrimination, whether it be employment discrimination or housing discrimination, where employers and landlords would unfortunately see families, potential lack of language skills or a tendency to not want to make waves and take advantage of that. And in addition, I saw a lot of families experience racism and, the different impacts of racism in their daily lives. And even when families were able to overcome those barriers and, so many of the families that I connected with had incredible success stories, but along with the success came some guilt, guilt from, making it, quote unquote, making it and being able to succeed. But with the knowledge that there are so many people that they know, or so many people in their family or in their close community who didn't have the opportunity to come to the United States and haven't been able to, and have been kind of stuck in this constant limbo. And in addition, throughout this time and, throughout their lives especially, there's a sense of homesickness for a lot of refugees that I interacted with and knew as friends. And then from the direct service provider's perspective, when I first started working with refugees, I was, of course, really excited, really motivated, but very quickly overwhelmed by the need of the families that I was serving. And this wasn't a unique situation. I think most people, when they first start interacting with refugees and newcomers, are surprised by how limited the resources are out there to serve people and to meet different needs. In addition, direct service providers are often incredibly understaffed. It's not uncommon to have, one caseworker helping, 50 to 70 people all at once. And so with that feeling of overwhelm and compassion fatigue, a lot of times people would feel direct service providers, employees and volunteers of nonprofits would become isolated, or just, they would allow the work to kind of engulf their lives. And for myself, that was definitely a temptation and something that I fell into again and again. One thing that I would often feel was I would often feel guilt if I wasn't able to meet the need of a family of that day. Or I would feel guilty if I was trying to take a rest, or my husband was encouraging me to take a vacation or to turn off my phone. It was very, very difficult for me to give up that sense of control and that sense of power. And then other people I worked with and continue to connect with have a different reaction of numbness to all of the need, and kind of just trying to look at it as like, I have to just help these people from 9 to 5, but after that I am done. And this compartmentalization, really ultimately is not really that possible for most people. So it would kind of lead to, difficult behaviors or avoiding situations just because, it was just really hard to deal with the realities of what our families were what the families we were serving were experiencing. And of course, there is just the true reality that there are no easy answers when it comes to serving families. There is a lack of resources, and so much of the time we would get phone calls from people who we couldn't even serve just because they weren't part of they weren't necessarily the quote unquote right status to serve. And so as a result, there was a lot of burnout within direct service providers. And I would say that for me personally, even though I worked with refugees and immigrants in a professional setting for 10 years, we received very little support in terms of helping families address the trauma of migration, or even, helping ourselves as we interact with traumatized populations day after day after day. So I say all of this not to depress you, but to kind of demonstrate the need for this, and also demonstrate how, like, I am personally so excited that Saulo and Elaine are here with us to be able to share their experiences and their stories. So without further ado, I am going to pass it along to Saulo.
Thank you, Charity. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. It's very important for us. This conversation is very important for us in this topic. I come to this conversation from different perspectives. One is as an immigrant myself. Just let me share briefly here. I am the son of a refugee. My father was a political refugee from Guatemala. When I was 10 years old and I was in 4th grade, we immigrated, or we crossed the border into Mexico and were refugees in Mexico with my father. When we were in Mexico during that time, my father applied for refugee status in Canada, and he went to Canada, and the rest of the family was separated, and we returned. So my brothers and sisters and my mother and I had to return to Guatemala. And we were separated for about 6 years during that period. So I experienced migration when I was 10 years old, 4th grade. And so my perspective also on migration and trauma is informed by this experience at a young age. And when I see children today, I'm very concerned about the situation that many of the children who are arriving today and migrating all over the place in the world are facing with their parents. Some of the things that happened during that time in my life, being in fourth grade, I was pulled out of school. I failed fourth grade, going to Mexico. In Mexico, I was studying in fourth grade, but then I was pulled again out of school and returned to Guatemala. And then I failed fourth grade in Mexico as well. When we arrived in Guatemala, my mother could not have the 5 children with us because she was going to be working full time. So my 2 younger siblings stayed with my mother in Guatemala City, and my sister and my brother and I, the older ones, we went to live with an uncle who had a few children as well. And during that year, then nobody really cared too much about our education. So I failed fourth grade again during that time. During that year, what I remember from that year is that my head got full of lice, my feet got fungus that I could not walk, and then that I used to wet my bed every night. And but then, you know, life continued there. My dad was then in Canada, and then we were in Guatemala. This picture in the center here is when I was graduating from 6th grade in elementary. And I was older already. And by this time, I was thinking that I wasn't really that smart anymore because I had failed fourth grade a couple of times already, and I was older. So then how this affects also the education of children and their thinking about themselves, their beliefs about themselves and others as well, and their behavior. So then that's one of the things that really informs my position. Today here in Goshen, Indiana, where I live, 58% of the children who are here are the sons and daughters of Latino, Latinas, immigrants, asylum seekers and refugees who are coming to the community. And many of them are not doing so well in school. And so we have to start asking why. And for many people in the administration, teachers, then they are thinking, well, these kids are just not smart, or they just don't like to go to school. But then it is this part of my life informs also my position then that there's something else going, and we should be asking the questions about what is happening, right? Not what is wrong with these children, but what is happening to these children, what has happened to their lives as well. The picture at the end here is when we arrived in Canada, and this is 1986. The other one was 1980, first migration to Mexico. 1986 is when we arrived in Canada. And in Canada, we arrived as residents, and we have all the documentation. By this time, my father had a good job. We had all the basic needs taken care of. But nobody really walked with us in talking to us about what had happened to us again, right? We had just left a family in Guatemala. My older sister could not come with us, so she stayed in Guatemala. And then we started, the weather changed, minus 25 degrees Celsius in Canada when we arrived in February of 1986. And we had just left Guatemala. It was 25 degrees Celsius over there. And the language and the food and everything else started changing. So many things happened during this time, but one of the things that affected us the most was that my mother fell into a very deep depression. And then a depression that continued through her life. And that is something that at this point, I continue to think that if we had had somebody who had walked with us on the psychosocial, informed us about, raised awareness in our family about trauma and what had just happened to us, maybe things would have been a little bit different. My mother passed away 4 years ago, and I truly believe that she was 71 years old, and she lived in constant battle with depression and deep sadness and loss and mourning that we experienced during this time. We know that we are not alone as immigrants and refugees. There are many people migrating today, 258 million, according to the International Organization for Migration. And of these millions of people, 124 million approximately are women, 36 million are children, and then refugees, 25 million, and migrant workers as well. So then all these people who are migrating, facing all these circumstances, and also that migration today compared to previous centuries, is also full of these obstacles that we as humans have placed. Border walls, we're forcing people to go into deserts, into the oceans and seas, and in very dangerous situations, and making them be in very vulnerable situations as well, which then exacerbates the situation for many people migrating today. So compared to then the past, then today it makes it harder just by the way that we have created certain things. Also, some of the things that we find in migrants today is that in the past, many migrants used to migrate in family groups, right? We can hear in the history of the United States, many people come in here in family groups. And today, many migrants are coming, or people are taking off on their own. Some families have to save money and then send a single person from their family on their way so that they can go and make some money and then send money back at home. So then the situation for many people who are migrating today is very different than people in previous generations as well. A psychologist, a psychiatrist, and also a professor from the University of Barcelona has talked about the losses in the mornings of migration. And he coined it the Ulysses Syndrome, or the immigrant syndrome. And he talks about these losses and the things that are specific that cause trauma to individuals who are migrating. And some of those are the loss of family. When people migrate, they leave family behind. And we experienced that with leaving my sister behind in Guatemala, but also our community, right? That was part of our family as well, our church community back in Guatemala. Also the loss of language, English being such a, you can hear today after 35 years in North America, this accent doesn't go away. English is and every day I think I learn a different language or a different term as well. So you continue to learn the language and struggle sometimes with language as well. I've known several people who have been here and they just come and start working right away. And if they're in environments where they're only speaking their language, also it gets harder for them. And we are asking them to learn the language. And also we're asking people to learn language when they are facing all this trauma. They have just gone through all these hardships of migration. So then it's very hard for them to pick up all the language as they are facing all the trauma. They have lost their culture as well, and many people have left all these customs and behind. The land, the loss of land, and also the color, the beautiful places. You know, if you have ever been in Latin America, many people go over there to vacation because it's a beautiful place. But a lot of the places where people are fleeing from today are also places where we go on vacation as well. So it's beautiful, the land where a lot of people are coming from. The social status, a lot of people who have come in. When my father arrived in Canada, he was a veterinarian. And when he arrived in Canada, he became a dishwasher, and he was working, as a janitor and many different jobs like that, because he could not find other jobs because of the language and also the hurdles to get to that social status again. And also the loss of an ethnic group. For many people who are part of an ethnic group in their land, then they lose that belonging to that group as well. And then for many people as well, the physical risk of migrating. For many people in the United States, they have had to cross the Rio Grande, or they have had to cross also the deserts in Arizona and New Mexico and other places as well. Places where thousands of people have lost their lives and have gone missing as well. So many people have lost their family, their loved ones. A lot of people have seen death along the way, or going through Mexico, Latin America, the Darien Gap in South America and in Central America. So then the physical risk is also something that a lot of people come here, and then how do we talk about it, what they have seen, and how do we process that information, that trauma they have gone through. So for that, also then we have invited Elena Zook Barge, who is a colleague, and I'm so excited to have you here, Elena. Thank you for joining us today, and let's talk about trauma and how it affects us. We cannot hear you yet.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Saulo. Thank you, Charity. Well, because it really is an honor to be here, and maybe I'll just say a few words of why I'm even here, and that's, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I spent most of the 80s and most of the 90s with Mennonite Central Committee working in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. All of those countries were in the middle of conflict and war, and it was there I learned about trauma and resilience, but we weren't using those terms then back in the 80s and the 90s. And so it's been a process over the years. I came back to the US in 98, and for the past about 20 years, I've been working with a program called STAR, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, which has helped me understand a lot of what I experienced in Central America and also understand what the people there are experiencing, particularly now, the folks that are on the move from different places to new homes. So it's really been about in the last 2 years, I think, that together with Saulo and some other people, we've been focusing on sort of the traumas of migration. And we've heard it already today. What we kept hearing over and over again was there are great agencies and organizations that are doing really, really trying to help, but so often it's the emotional component that's being left out, or it's on the back burner, or it's just not. There might be a social worker, but it's not something that everybody's trauma informed and understands and knows. So that's sort of why we are where we are right now. And I'm going to put my screen up. And I'm going to have to go way back to the beginning. And that's where we have come to the point we're at now of developing what is AITM, addressing the impact and trauma of migration, which is both a seminar, workbook, it's a services that we hope to offer. And just well, in the last month or so, we finished the Spanish translation of the workbook, Addressing the Impact and Trauma of Migration, thanks to a lot of hard work on Saulo's part. And I think as of this week, they're both available on Amazon. So that makes us very, very happy. But basically what the thinking is behind this work that we're doing, and what we want to share, what I would like to share a little bit today with you, is that if awareness of migrated related stress and trauma, the impact of it and practical tools for addressing it is integrated into programs and organizations, then migrants, service providers, and host communities will be able to reduce stress, heal wounds, mitigate harm, and solve problems, which will produce, in the long run, emotional well-being, better policies and practices, and more cohesive communities. I even as I read that, I think, oh my goodness, what a great big job. But I really, really believe this. I really believe if we were more trauma and resilience aware in this whole area, things could be changed, and we could and be different. There doesn't need to be this much migration related trauma. So just to say that this is based, the content of this workbook and seminar we've based on the STAR curriculum, concepts, and model, which was developed at Eastern Mennonite University back in 2001. And for those, I'm sure some of you are familiar with STAR, but for those who aren't and would be interested in knowing a bit more about it, I would suggest reading the little book of Trauma Healing by Carolyn Yoder. It was just revised in 2020, and that gives the narrative of the sort of the content of what we're trying to do here and the base of what we're doing here. So what I would like to do is just, Charity and Saulo both have done, I don't need to say much more to this, but I want to just add a little bit to sort of the trauma that's faced directly by people who are on the migration journey. But then there's also trauma is impacting the service providers, which can be the medical, the legal, the law enforcement. They also are being impacted by this trauma, whether they're aware of it or not, just because they indirectly are hearing the stories and they're working with folks. So I just I wanted to this is a great article here that I would recommend reading. It's from a school in Maryland where they have a lot of undocumented children, and it says new culture, new language, new culture. I can't see the top of my screen right now, so to keep reading it, but you can see it there. They've got challenges: housing, health insurance, gaps in schooling. But perhaps the single most defining characteristic of this population, in this case, we're talking about undocumented, is the considerable trauma they have experienced in their home countries during the journey and in the U.S. And again, we've heard what some of those are. But I just wanted to show, this is one of the exercises that we begin with oftentimes in the pilots that we have done, both online and in person. And that is, before we even talk about the Ulysses Syndrome and the list of traumas, we have the group that we're working with just together in groups, and they come up with what they know already about what are some of the stressors and the traumas that might be that in these 4 different areas. And again, every group is different, but you learn so much. It's such a rich activity of learning. And what we've realized is that there are many, many people who are connected to this migration related trauma. And so, for example, when we're doing a seminar in Tucson or on the border, they may know a whole lot more about the trauma and the stressors coming from pre-migration and from the journey itself. And so they have long lists over here, but they know very little about the resettlement or the integration. And then, we go to Goshen, and we're working with the parent teacher liaisons there. And they have much longer lists on the resettlement and integration. So again, I think there's just real benefit in even those of us who are doing this work getting together and sharing our experiences, because there's a whole lot, depending on what our work is and what our involvement is, there's a whole lot that we're unaware of ourselves as far as what's happening out there. So this has been a very rich activity in the seminar. I would also just say, I want to just comment on something that Charity was talking about, and that's secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. And yeah, again, just in the last week, I was talking with folks from the receiving community in Poland that are receiving Ukrainian refugees, and again, hearing very clearly this coming through, even they weren't familiar with compassion fatigue. That's exactly what I was hearing. And I was in another conversation with the sheriff and folks from down on this county on the border in Arizona, and they also are overwhelmed with the trafficking and what they're seeing and what they're experiencing and the hopelessness, helplessness of what do we do with all this. So this covers a whole lot of people who are indirectly impacted, I think, in this work. So secondary trauma is simply experiencing trauma reactions yourself as a result of witnessing, either seeing or listening to another person's traumatic or traumatic experience. And so people who are in the helping profession, who have big hearts and are really good at what they're doing, are often very, very susceptible to compassion fatigue. Because if in ongoing secondary trauma can lead to compassion fatigue. If you are hearing or witnessing in some way others' experiences, traumatic experiences, it's just what's been coined compassion fatigue is this condition characterized by emotional and physical, and I would say spiritual exhaustion that leads to this diminished ability to be able to empathize or feel compassion for others. So it's often described as the negative cost of caring. And I think it manifests itself physically in many, many ways. There are many signs, but 2 of the big ones are the isolation, withdrawing. You find yourself withdrawing from people in general, and you often, your productivity at work goes down, and you're just like, okay, there's somebody here in front of me, but I don't want to hear another story. I can't hear another story. And so that's when a pretty big sign of compassion fatigue. There's also compassion satisfaction, which is the positive part of caring for others. So compassion satisfaction can mitigate the effects of compassion fatigue, but there has to be some good self-care in there, and not just individual self-care. I would totally underline what Charity said. It needs to be self-care, and it needs to be not only by the individual, it needs to be organizational care and policies and practices in place to support people who are in these kind of roles. I would just want to say it's not, compassion fatigue is not the same as burnout. Burnout is usually a piece of it. Often they'll say it's burnout plus secondary trauma is what can lead to compassion fatigue. And again, I would just say that the signs of it can progress really rapidly. So Charles Figley down in Florida says it's not uncommon to find a caregiver become debilitated within a year of beginning to experience signs of compassion fatigue. And especially if you're not getting vacation, you're not getting any time off, and you're listening and listening and listening and working too much, and then something happens to you, it really can exponentially go very, very, very quickly. This is just, I want to put this up here. It's the Professional Quality of Life website. And again, it's just 30 questions for anyone who's interested in sort of thinking more about what's the assessment tool of whether you might have a compassion fatigue or compassion satisfaction or burnout. And you answer these 30 questions, and then there is a way to sort of figure up your totals. And it's a bit complicated, so we're not going to do it here, but some of you may be interested, and it's also available in many different languages. Yeah. So what I would like to do now is just very, very briefly go through sort of just the three pieces, the main pieces of the STAR model that we use in AITM in this program. And, you know, we're looking at the impact on the body, the brain, the beliefs and behavior. And I just cannot do hardly any presentation without talking a little bit about the impacts on the body, brain, and nervous system, because it's just so fundamental and it's so key. And it's something I think everybody should know. So after we go through a traumagenic event, literally the reactions and the things that we experience are really varied, because they really impact our emotions, they impact us physically, they impact us our thinking, mentally, spiritually, they impact our whole being. And every experience literally is different. So all three of us presenters could go through the same experience, and we may have different of these reactions. They're all common reactions to very overwhelming situations. Okay, the only thing that is going to happen to all of us is the red line up here that goes to the physiological responses, the fight, flight, or freeze. That's the only thing that's going to happen, because they happen automatically. That's the way we're wired. It's the way we're made to respond, and it's to save us. It's to keep us safe and to keep us secure. And so the fight, flight, freeze is going to happen. And if we fight or if we run, we'll use up some of this. Let me back up. When this happens automatically, what's generated in us is this incredible energy. And I call it survival energy or trauma energy or whatever you want to call it. But it's like this little tornado in our body that gives us that energy to fight or to run. When we are able to run or fight or defend ourselves, we release some of that energy. But when we freeze, we don't. And that energy literally gets stuck in our bodies, in our muscles, in our nervous system, inside, and it can stay stuck there for years. And that is what is causing a lot of times the re-experiencing what happened, reliving the experience, all this kind of thing is more from the trapped trauma energy from the actual event itself. So part of what we need to do is we need to learn from the wild animals, because whenever they go through a traumatic event, what they do is they literally cry. No, they don't cry. Maybe they shake and they snort and they do really deep breathing, and they release that energy and they complete this natural physiological process. And what do? Well, we often try to shut it right down. I'll try to give you a hug, calm you down. And if that doesn't work, or my kind words, we might have to medicate. And so what we're doing is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing for ourselves and for others. If we sense this and we need to pay attention to sensations that we're full of energy, and it needs to be released, find a way to release that. If we're with somebody and we're hearing their story, the best thing Peter Levine says we can do is simply put our hand on the middle of their back and tell them your body knows exactly what it needs to do at this point. Let yourself shake and release and complete the natural physiological process, and we'll be able to move forward in much better. The body and the brain work in tandem. So whenever the body has gone into high gear, like and you're full of this adrenaline, cortisol, and all this survival energy, that's because the brain has gone into low gear. So you don't have to be a neuroscientist, but just to understand a little tiny bit of the brain really helps people understand what's going on, both with themselves or when they're dealing with other people who've gone through traumatic events. And so understanding the three-part brain. This is the brain stem, the instinctual brain down here, which is all about now, and its job. They're automatic reactions. It controls my breathing, my blood circulation. It does all that without me thinking about it. In the middle part of the brain is the limbic system, or the emotional brain, we like to call it, and that's sort of our smoke detector. And whenever there's threat or there's fear, that's where it's registered, and it connects with the brain stem, which is what floods our body with this trauma energy, which leaves our rational brain, which is the largest for human beings, mostly offline because it's too slow to respond. This is the part of our brain that knows what happened yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and it's a part that can do the speech, the language, the thinking, the math, the planning, and all that good stuff. But whenever we are stressed or in danger, this is the lower part of our brain is the part that has that's in control. And I'm just going to use that little green line up there at the top of the top left corner to symbolize what we call the connecting brain, or the middle prefrontal cortex. And that connects all three of these parts of the brain. So whenever we're in situations of calm, basically our brain is working together in a very integrated way. But what happens when we're in stress or in traumatic stress, we go into our lower brain. Our body goes into high gear and the brain into low gear. And one of the best explanations for this, of how this works, is on YouTube. And it's by Dr. Daniel Siegel, called Brain in the Palm of Your Hand. And I think, do we have time to see it? Or maybe not? Do you think?
I think we can, yeah.
Okay. So
it's
if you would help
only
me with
3
that.
minutes or 2 minutes.
It's 2 minutes, yes, right.
So yes.
Okay, thank you.
So Elaine, if you could stop sharing your screen,
sorry.
then I'll share mine, yeah.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
You're muted, Elaine.
Now can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So the one of the really important things here again is the releasing we talked about earlier. We need to have tools that will help us be able to be aware of when we're in this state, and when our lids are flipped and we're functioning out of our lower brain, and have the tools to be able to release energy and reintegrate our brain again, because it will make a big difference on how we respond to the context that we're in, or the situation or the problem that's there in front of us. So Levine and Siegel we're doing a lot of work with, I'm putting up this, I see what's happening. So we need to learn, part of what we need to do is learn a lot more about sensations, which has to do with the brainstem. We need to do feelings, and we need to do thoughts, because what we do right now is we try to talk about things right away before really feeling the feelings and before paying attention and really letting the sensations or the energy release from our bodies. And so we need to, it's almost like two new languages we need to be learning here. Let me just say, this is all connected. So the body, the brain, and the nervous system. The nervous system, the vagus nerve, I just have to say something about it, because it's something it's the science behind what Levine and what Daniel Siegel have been working on for years. And that has to do with the vagus nerve, which is the largest nerve in our body, and it connects from our brainstem all the way down through our body to all the different organs and to our face. And so it's picking up all these messages and sending messages, and there are more messages literally coming from our gut up to our brain than from our brain down to our body. And so Stephen Porges said that basically what's happening is that he calls it neuroception, but that in our body, it's always scanning in our body for safety and asking, is it safe? Are we safe? And we're receiving all this information from outside and from inside without even thinking about it going through our brain. So this is all, again, working together with the body and the brain. And he developed the Polyvagal Theory, which can be pretty complicated, but we're just it's also very helpful in understanding what's going on, how we're responding to safety and threat. And this is just, he says that there's three different, it's like a hierarchy of the way our body nervous system responds. So in calm times, it's as if our brains are integrated. We're up here at the top of the ladder. The social engagement, we're getting our cues of safety. There's smiles, it's tone of voice, it's all these kinds of things that we're wired to connect, right? But if there's threat or if there's danger, we very quickly can move into mobilization, fight, flight. That's a second sort of stage. And if that doesn't work, then we can go into immobilization, into the freeze or submit. But remembering that energy is there no matter where we are in that state, on that ladder. Now we move up and down this ladder many times during a day. So there's not a right or wrong or good or bad about any of this. It's just a healthy nervous system will have the tools to be able to shift and to be able to somehow come back up to the top of the ladder. Again, if you have some very practical tools for releasing and for regulating. So there's so much more that could be said here. I just want to say this because I think when we're talking about migration trauma, if you think about the threat that people live in and if it's long term, or I'm even thinking about the child living with the threat of deportation of a parent and coming home every day wondering if mom is going to be at home, if depending, that can keep you in one of these mobilization, hypervigilant, hypovigilant, or immobilized, and long term that really can have an impact on how we think and how we feel and how we act. So it becomes that's why it's so important to have tools to be able to self-regulate and to co-regulate. What happens if we aren't able to release this trauma energy or address the trauma? Father Richard Rohr from the Center for Action and Contemplation says it very well. Pain that's not transformed is transferred. That energy from trauma that's not transformed is transferred. And it basically gets turned into harming ourselves. We turn it against ourselves and hurt ourselves, or we act out and we hurt others. And we end up, this is some of the things that acting in behaviors that we do as a way to try to soothe the pain. It's a way, it usually helps for a little bit, but it often ends up causing us more harm and more trauma to ourselves. If we act out, and on the right hand side, you'll see some of the ways the ways that manifests or looks. When we do that, we simply have caused another traumagenic event. And so depending on what that person or those groups do with that pain and with that wound, we literally can end up spinning on these cycles of violence, hurting ourselves, hurting others in the family, at the family level, in organizations, and in communities and nations. And so this is where I think this becomes a good analysis for understanding, especially conflict, or for preventing conflict. If we see what's happening, and how do we interrupt, how do we address this pain and be able to interrupt these cycles of harm that we're spinning in and that we're seeing in many places. So that's the second part of it, that the cycles of harm. And then this is just simply putting together the trauma experience part one with the cycles of harm. And then the third part is looking at together, how do we address this? How do we break out of these cycles of harm? And when we're doing that, we're building resilience. We're building individual and we're building collective resilience. Again, releasing is key the whole way through. Safety and support is very, very helpful the whole way through on the journey. But it's not linear, and it's not like you have to go through all these steps. These simply are tools and processes for helping individuals and groups be able to address trauma. But in this case, we're looking at migration related trauma. My hope is and the goal is for individual and collective well-being. And I really believe if we could all somehow learn to regulate self and co-regulation, if we could learn to relate, resolve conflicts, and problem solve, I think our world will be a different place. I think we're going to have to turn our brain upside down, and we're going to have to pay more attention first to sensations and to feelings and then thoughts. But I really believe 50, 60 years ago, we didn't all know we needed to brush our teeth every day, but we do now. And we can learn this as well. We can all learn this, right? And I think once we do, I think we're going to be able to better work at changing and repairing the migration, the structures and the systems, the practices and the policies that need to be changed together. That's my hope.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for that. And well, we're open for questions as well. If people want to send us questions, we have a few minutes. We are going till 15 past the hour. If we have this webinar for a few more minutes, but if you have to leave within the hour, then this will be recorded as well for everyone. And so if you have any questions, please put them on the Q&A or in the chat for us.
So I do see some questions. Us just saying, I'm really curious about the experience Saulo mentioned regarding his father working as a veterinarian in Guatemala and then as a dishwasher in Canada. Can that experience be traumatic, even if it's not a specific traumatic event, but a sort of low-level degradation experienced every day? Either one of you.
Elaine, do you want to go for it?
I think you can. You should answer that one.
Well, yes, I think, you know, it does affect people. I would say it's traumatic in the sense that a lot of people, then the sense of loss, that's what we're talking about, the sense of loss of status, and also who people used to be in their community. And I would say for my father, coming from being a student and then a veterinarian in Guatemala, working at a clinic, and then going to wash dishes, and not only that, but the loss of language and so many other things that he had to face. At some point, he was a dishwasher, and also he was living in his car in the winter in Canada. So all these things, you know, I've heard somebody just asking an immigrant, well, so how is, you know, your experience? And then they say, well, yeah, you know, the food is not, you know, it's not too bad. But then they say, how's the weather? Well, the weather is not too bad. And then, you know, so they keep asking them, and they say, not too bad. But then with all these things compound, then that's where it hits you, right? So it's one thing, but it's also all these sort of things that you have lost in all these mornings that at the compound, it's the compound of all those things that also hits people many times.
I would add one thing to it. I think it's also probably partly a dignity violation, which is another big cause of trauma reactions. And that is, I mean, your worth as a human being, you can't help but feel that, I think, and it feels diminished in some way because we put so much, I don't know, so much attention, I think, into that. And so I think the dignity violation might come in there as well, even though it's not deliberately with somebody against somebody else, just the whole situation, like you say, can cause that. Mm-hmm.
I see another question. How would you be able to deal with small children that are experiencing the fear of losing parents? You know, how can you help parents or children deal with that fear and that, you know, I think you mentioned a little bit of it, but.
Well, I would do the finger holds. And I didn't take time to do that because it's one of my favorite exercises, but it literally is it's a wonderful tool, and where you identify your feelings of what you're feeling, and then each of the fingers is a different emotion. So if you're fearful and afraid, you would probably hold the index finger, or you might hold anxiety, the middle finger, and do some deep breathing with that. I'm just remembering again, one of our participants in Tucson. I don't know if the child was necessarily fearful at that point, but was very much acting out, and they just were having a real, you know, there was probably it was a child of 4 that wasn't able to probably articulate or say what he was feeling. And the person working there with him just didn't even, you know, didn't have to explain the exercise or whatever, just simply held some of his fingers and did some deep breathing together, and then he held some of her fingers. This was a person who had just taken the training, had just taken the seminar, and this was her way of applying it. And it was beautiful because it just shows there's so many ways to do this stuff. It's not like you have to have this recipes on this or that, but just having some basic tools that you use yourself, then it becomes easier to improvise and to use, you know, with a child like that, or with somebody in a displaced camp that's feeling really fearful or whatever. So that would be mine. Finger hold is one of my favorites.
And we have talked also, Elaine, about, you know, the thumb, right? How babies to soothe themselves and start sucking on their thumbs as well. So it's a natural thing also. Our bodies know how to heal themselves too, in some ways, right?
Yes, yes, definitely.
Yeah, Kirsten is sharing the Capacitar tools in the links as well, which are really good tools for this work as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I would even say they have a lot of like a simple kit that you can just download, but they also have some really good resource books on accompanying refugees and utilizing a lot of their tools with that. So it's a very good resource.
And when we send the email with the recording, we'll also be sending links to the different resources that have been shared throughout this webinar. So don't worry about that. And then as Elena mentioned, I think the workbook will be on Amazon. Is it on Amazon now, Elena?
Yeah, well, yet the English one was, the Spanish one, the picture was there, but it still said not available. But hopefully, that was yesterday. So I'm hoping by today or tomorrow it will be available.
Wonderful. And we'll include a link to that.
Also, see, there's a question about, they say, I have a close friend who works with a lot of people who speak only Spanish. He thinks they don't care about learning English because they are able to have a job and friends without it. Is this true? Well, in part, there's a lot of people who come and they right away jump into the workforce and are working in factories. And so it's not that they don't care. It's one of the things is that they're working 10 hours a day and 6 days a week. And so learning English, then it becomes very, very complex for them. But also for some of them, they are in these parts of the brain. And if you have such in a classroom, when you're in this survival mode part of the brain, then you cannot, very seldom do you get to the creative part of the brain, the one that's social, the one that learns. Then that's very hard. And that's what we're finding also with kids in the school system who are in that part of the brain, who are ready to fight, to flight, or some of them are freezing and acting out in different ways. It's not that they don't want to learn. It's just that we haven't found a way to also provide them safety, for them to feel safe and regulate to the point where they can be creative, when they are able to learn and they are able to function in a way that they can be learning.
And one thing I'll add, just from like a direct service provider's perspective, sometimes people will have a great desire to learn, but there simply aren't English classes available to them. In many different parts of the United States, there's just not enough English classes or other services for people to access. So even if they are at the point where like they have enough time, or are at a point where they are ready to learn, they might not necessarily have access to learn. So that's another element, especially for those in the adult ESL world. I can add to.
Mm-hmm.
And also we should emphasize too that these tools are to work with people who are facing trauma, but also people who are facing at this point real danger and fear, and also so we have to continue to seek for the processes and continue to advocate for changes in law and policies that also provide safety for people. At this point, we have people who have been here undocumented for 20 years. Imagine living for 20 years with that hole in your gut and living in that survival mode for 20 years. And your children are here, and the children then are picking up a lot of this as well. So then we have talked about hurt people, and also how this is transferred to our children. So then we start seeing that in the school system now, in society. So I think, like Elaine said, hopefully we can start then moving all this into schools, into police departments, into ICE, DHS, the legal system, so we can start being informed about this, creating some empathy. One thing that we have found during the seminars as well is that this starts, as we become trauma informed and trauma aware, also we start creating some empathy as well. So we're hoping that through this work, then we can start creating more awareness and also empathy and start changing systems.
Yes, and I'm hoping we're going to somehow we'll get this connected into developing a trauma-informed asylum immigrant refugee system here in the United States.
Right.
But we're still searching for that.
Yes. We'll be sharing also through an email that will come out your way after Charity, right? We'll be sharing some of these, a lot of these tools that we've talked today.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So next steps, of course, is, share what you've learned to those you are working with. If you are connected with a group that's already serving refugees or asylum seekers or other migrants, one great step would just be to share this recording and kind of discuss what you've learned. We will be sending a recording to everybody who is registered for this webinar, along with links to different resources, including HDPI's Migration Trauma Awareness resources. And then our next webinar is coming up on Tuesday, June 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic will be welcoming asylum seekers. If you have any questions or, want to connect with more resources, feel free to reach out to us at welcome@mcc.org. And we hope to see you for our next webinar. If there are any more questions, though, feel free to send them in the chat. But if there isn't, we will close up shop.
There are a couple questions that have showed up. One is about the trauma of Afghan refugees, and the exact is what special trauma should we be aware of with Afghan refugees coming to the U.S. And then there's a second question, which is when can the wounded become healers? So maybe Elena and Saulo and Charity, you can respond to those two questions.
Elena?
Well, I would just say, I think the Afghan question, I would simply say, I think if a safe space can be provided for them to even think about and look at sort of the sources of trauma, they know it. They know the answer to that, and it's different for everybody. So I can't answer that there's a special trauma that should be looked at there. My guess is if they looked at all the sources of trauma that from which it comes, there will be people coming in that could, again, some of it's more individual, some of it's collective, some of it's historical. Again, there will be it will be different for everybody. I personally haven't had the opportunity yet. I have not worked with the Afghan refugees, but I know that the Church World Service Resettlement Office here in Harrisonburg, Virginia, which was our first pilot, was with folks from that office and from other places here in Virginia. I'm hoping that they're using some of the things that they learned in the pilot course with the refugees. We have a large group of them here in Harrisonburg. In fact, this is a good question. I would really like to ask this question to them.
And I would add that with any population that has been forcibly displaced and displaced in such a violent way as well, then yes, they will be suffering same as people who are facing war and displacement, forced displacement. Then well, some of these tools I think will work. Also, if you want to we talk about the roots and causes of migration in the workbook as well, but you can find a lot of that also, information about root causes of migration, and also how to work with these populations. I say that we have talked about trauma is trauma, right? And we all face trauma as well. And I think some of the tools that we have mentioned here, some of the tools in Capacitar that we also talked about, will respond to some of those questions as well. But I will say also that there is no specific trauma for the Afghan people as it is for the Central American people. They're all facing almost the same trauma. Venezuelans, a lot of people who are coming from the same places facing trauma. Yeah.
What was the other question? I'm sorry, I don't remember the other one. There was another one.
Yeah, the other question is about when the wounded become healers. And I know, Saulo, I mean, in your journey, as you shared your journey, I think you were also modeling that or sharing about that, but maybe you all could expand on that.
Right. Yeah. I slowly, the part of the journey has been, going through this snail process that Elaine pulled out. In some ways, we have to memorialize and think about these things and talk about the narratives, and also maybe in some ways rewrite these narratives in our brains about how we've been hurt and how this trauma has affected us. And then we start reconnecting sometimes with the people. A lot of this trauma has affected me in my relationship with my father. And I will have to say that out of that experience, my mother became depressed, but also then pills became a way that she numbed herself. My father became a workaholic, and that also then affected me and created then these cycles of harm. So then reconnecting with my father, reconnecting with this connection with my mother as well, and then creating new narratives in my brain. Some of these tools, being aware. Awareness is such an important part of this, and it's such a beautiful thing that we become aware, and then we start learning more and more about ourselves and what our brain is doing. And one thing, maybe a short story, and then I'll end there, is that when I became aware about how this was affecting me during a START training in Virginia, at the same time, one of my daughters called me, and she had just moved and got married. And in my experience, I had experienced a lot of separation as a child. From my mother, from my father, and then so I had created this mechanism to separate with people very quick. And my daughter, I was using this mechanism when she moved out and when she got married. So she called me at some point, and I was already aware of what was happening, what I was doing, and then we both ended up crying on the phone, and then just talking about it, how that affected me, and then also, but the awareness part of this, right? I started recognizing what I was doing. And I think that's a big part. So awareness, being educated, but also then doing some of these or practicing some of these tools, I think is what has helped me.
And I would simply add, I think the more we heal our wounds, the better able we are to help others work with their wounds. And so it's a journey. It's not like you just do one thing and you're healed. It's a journey. It's a process. But the more we do the work, the better able we are to help others, but also to maintain then some sort of balance and boundaries in our lives as we do that. So it's a process that we learn as we keep walking.
Yes. And sometimes you think you're done, and then you have to retouch back again in some of these tools, and then you continue as well. Thank you for the questions.
Let's see. Oh no. Kirsten, do you see any other questions, or?
Maybe in the Q&A, there might be one about, I think there's one that hasn't been addressed about children, then the fear of losing their parents, I think. Did you all already talk about that one?
I believe we did.
Okay. I don't think there are any more questions then that I can find.
Okay, great. Well, if you all have other questions, feel free to reach out to us at welcome@mcc.org, and we will be sending those resources and a recording of this presentation to you all in the next couple of days. Thank you so much for joining us for this time and sharing a conversation with us about addressing the trauma of migration. We wish you the best as you go on throughout your day.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.